crystallize potential partnerships with the city to begin implementing some of those goals and improving some of the policy framework. But really the last slide that I wanted to share with you guys was really kind of like a slide to share sort of what are the type of questions that we're hoping this report helps answer. Is the mayor investing equitably in coastal protection so that vulnerable communities receive a fair level of attention? Is that really happening? Are New Yorkers most vulnerable communities prepared for the next one? What does that mean? And are we really there? And then finally, are city agencies coordinating to ensure a comprehensive and effective design implementation, the effective design and implementation of resiliency efforts in New York? So I'm going to stop there. I'm really happy to answer any questions and discuss any comments. If you are interested in receiving a direct copy of the report, make sure you sign up in the list. I'll make sure that you guys receive one. And with that, I really hope to address the discussion and engage in the discussion and address your comments and questions. Thank you.
Button that says class. Oh, okay. And the book ends. Thank you. We really had time to Juan. Alden, I guess you have the enviable task of responding to what you've heard, the perspective that you have at Bedside Restoration as a resident of
First of all, it's a pleasure for me to be here, and I'm a big fan of Ron's. He was very instrumental in the creation of Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration where I work, and that was more than 49 years ago. Ron was doing all the work that led to the creation of Bedford Stuyvesant Restoration. We'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. I want to apologize in advance. I'm a little overdressed, but there's a reason for that. I'm co-hosting an event tonight, but I was so eager to say yes to Ron that I forgot to consult with my spouse about where I'm supposed to be. So I'm gonna have to leave a little early.
I know what this is like.
Yeah. So I was trying to make sense of my thoughts about this, and so I started thinking about, I guess I should also say that Restoration is a comprehensive community development corporation, which means that we focus on a range of things that we believe are necessary for a healthy community. And we've been doing that for 49 years, so it involves everything from workforce development to housing to commercial revitalization, arts and culture, small business development. So that's the prism. Those are some of the prisms by which I want to just touch base on this subject. I'm not a student of the subject, so this has been a great learning opportunity for me. We do have what's called a weatherization program at Restoration, which we've been running for probably 30 some odd years, which is in this space in a very elementary way, because we're involved in making buildings in central Brooklyn more energy efficient. And I would say probably as a rule, the buildings are very inefficient. They're old and energy inefficient. And so I guess we're making some contribution to the reduction of carbon in the environment. However, we're not, and this is a federally funded program, and the monies flow through the states to providers in communities, but we're not pushing the kinds of technology that probably will make the biggest difference. And I guess when I say that, I'm thinking a lot about renewable energy. The other things that I think about in this context would be financial stability of the families. and how these factors that we just heard about would affect that. How would it affect economic upward mobility? Because a lot of the families are low income, but we're also concerned about moderate income people and their ability to sustain themselves and move ahead to achieve their aspirations. We're concerned about housing stability. So the question is, how would these factors affect that? We're concerned about minority business development, job creation and job training. And we're concerned about health disparities. And transportation. A lot of the people in the communities we're talking about don't have easy access to mass transit. Like in Brooklyn, we talk about 2 and 3 fared zones, and that's where a lot of folks who we consider vulnerable to live. Now, I'm a proponent of economic and racial integration. And so you can see how that's cross-cutting in a sense. My view of this is that we've got vulnerable communities that are economically isolated. And that means that oftentimes the interests of the majority don't align with the interests of people who are living in a different place and are not connected to the mainstream economy. So what we have been advocates for is, for example, mixed income housing, which means that people in different incomes will live together in the same building, the same community. It would be less easy to isolate these vulnerable populations geographically. Now, what's happening in communities like the one where I work and nearby communities is that there is a fair amount of what we call gentrification or demographic change or reclamation or whatever you want to call it going on, which means that more affluent people are moving into the communities, but at the same time, there's displacement and also often higher levels of economic polarization within the community, which means what? Bedford-Stuyvesant, for example, is got a very large, low-density housing stock in the middle of it, and on the periphery we have a lot of public housing and federally subsidized and tax credit housing. So there's geographic isolation within the community. And actually, in one community board, the low density housing that's being more frequently occupied by the more affluent people is actually closer to the transit facilities. So you can see how that causes sort of a separation of interest, if you will. So when I think about this, I also think about what we talked about, which is economic upward mobility. So I'm thinking there's a huge opportunity, in a sense, for people who need job training and need jobs to be trained in industries that are emerging. One of the very sad things is that there are very few minorities involved in the trades related to infrastructure building. There are very few minority firms, and there are very few minorities working at the actual task. Horace Williams, remember Horace Williams? You know Horace Williams well. I didn't know him that well, but he told me all about sandhogs. I guess those are the folks who dig out the tunnels. I would think that there'd be a lot of minorities in sandhogs. It just seems like something you'd want. I guess they get paid a lot of money, that's why there are not too many who are minority. But then very few minority sandhogs. So I'm thinking about all the opportunity that there might be for people, and I don't know whether this requires, how much training it requires, but it's certainly something that we could be involved in and could help promote, both in terms of the workers and in terms of the minority businesses. The other thing that struck me about this is messaging. Because I think a lot of the work, I've been doing this work for almost 20 years now, but a lot of what we're focusing on in my space is how we communicate with people and how we get people to move, to take action around specific things that we think are important. And the challenge is often how do you communicate the importance so they think it's important, so others think it's important. And I had a little bit of a challenge here because to me this is very important. And I think to people who have the bandwidth to think about other than their everyday challenges, this would be important. You say 2 decades, you're like, that's soon. But for a lot of folks, there's no bandwidth to think about 2 decades from now. They're thinking about 2, 3, 4 hours from now. They're thinking about tomorrow. And so, my thought was there's urgency here. But how do you communicate it in a way that doesn't overwhelm people so much that they say, I just can't even think about this. I have other challenges that I have to deal with. And I think that's part of what you think about all the time. So I'll end here because I guess there'll be a conversation that comes out of this, but I just wanted to give my initial reaction to what I see as both the challenges and the opportunity, and much of it aligns very much with what Juan said.
I have some comments, but why don't you hold them until after Jim?
Thanks, Owen. Thanks for coming out, everybody. Great to see you. Can you hear me? Okay, in the back there? Great, thanks. So great to be on this panel and to meet you, Coco. It's a pleasure. I had a few thoughts that I put together before this evening, so I want to share those and then maybe reflect a little bit on what I heard. Right off the bat, Ilya mentioned this idea of interconnectivity, and it's something that I think we here at Pratt, I'm here representing this academic institution on this panel, and really this interconnectivity between social, ecological, and infrastructural challenges that we see in the face of climate change. Ron and I and many others at Pratt have been very involved in work that we call the RAMP initiative. It stands for Recovery, Adaptation, Mitigation, and Planning. This was really a series of workshops, symposiums, courses, events, very similar to this one, where professionals, academicians, students, and community members really came together, shared their best practices, and tried to look at these interconnected issues related to climate change adaptation. I want to segue a little bit into these two words, adaptation and mitigation. I think there's some important difference there. Scientifically speaking, in terms of emissions and emissions reduction, and a lot of the agreements that came out of the Paris talks, this idea of mitigation is no longer possible. It's kind of how I feel. I feel we're at a point now where we're talking purely about adaptation. So just to put a finer point on that, it's coming, the change is here, we're seeing it, we talk about it, we make jokes about wacky weather, but we're seeing things like nuisance flooding all the time now in areas that didn't receive flooding before. So the time is now one of adaptation. And in this work that we've done recently, I mean most specifically right now I'm working with members of the Red Hook community. It's a studio that we're doing here at Pratt, looking at that community's, I don't know how to control that.
It's very sensitive.
Okay, I'll just keep talking. So really looking at and helping the Red Hook community get their hands around this idea of an integrated flood protection system. Thank you, Ali. Can you hear me still? Okay. Great, that seems to be working. So an integrated flood protection system is what is it really? How do we wrap our heads around that? What is that going to do for the community of Red Hook? So as we begin to think about all of these climate change adaptation measures, we have to be realistic in understanding that these measures or governmental programs or initiatives have an overlay of social and environmental injustice. Okay? So I wrote this down to get it specifically. Because inherently they disregard the very complex and ever-present social constructs of racism, poverty, and inequitable access to power. This might be pure energy, as Juan Camilo was pointing out for us and the folks in Brownsville. This might be political power. This might be access to education or access to workforce and employment opportunities, right? So these resiliency measures that we're seeing, these climate change adaptation measures that the city is currently going through, they're not taking these things into account. These are very complex issues. I find that with technical adaptation like flood walls, sea berms, sea gates, we just learned from the Army Corps of Engineers that their greatest sort of approach for mitigating or for providing resiliency to Jamaica Bay and the community surrounding Jamaica Bay is to put a sea gate right between, the entrance at the mouth of the bay. That's a huge infrastructural investment. I really don't know what a sea gate is going to do for the youth in the Rockaways that need employment opportunities and access to education, right? So the pure placement of infrastructure, it really runs the risk of being cost prohibitive and failing. As we heard from Juan Camilo, climate change isn't just about storm surge. It's not just about rising sea levels. It's about heat. It's about many different impacts that are all interconnected, like Ilya shared with us. And until we start to think about a level of specificity that we do in our technical measures, right? Like we all see these maps, right, that tell us how high the water is going to be. And we have design flood elevation and base flood elevation and all these types of technical measurements that have a very high level of specificity. But when we get to issues of social resilience and social injustice, the specificity disappears, right? So how are we going to have interventions without specificity? And I think Juan Camilo really got to that in this sort of comprehensive definition of disadvantaged communities, right? That's a start. Then we're going to move on to a comprehensive definition of equity, of racism, of social injustice. And so I think this idea of specificity really stuck out to me. But then when I turn and I think about mitigation, I sort of argue with myself. And I'm saying, okay, so what is mitigation then? If it's not emissions reductions, if we've already sort of hit our max that our sort of atmosphere can handle, how do we do mitigation, right? So mitigation becomes righting the wrongs of social and environmental injustices that are pervasive in our societies, both here in New York and globally. It's about ameliorating the impacts of climate change on our most vulnerable populations. Our climate change interventions and innovations have to address inequality, and if not, like I said earlier, they're just expensive pieces of infrastructure that might fail, right? So I'm trying not to be totally complaining about this, and I'm going to say a little bit about what I think the academic institutions can do, right? And I think with the REC model, we've really done a great effort in trying to continue and trying to sincerely approach this work, right? So what is it really? It's developing and hosting workshops, courses, and symposiums very similar to this one that talk about the interrelated issues of climate change adaptation. It's increasing the capacity of communities and community leadership to understand and engage in climate change adaptation and helping them create the information and the tools to do so collaboratively. It's about engaging all disciplines, architects, planners, activists, engineers, ecologists, all around the table to come up with these innovations and these solutions. And then it's about sharing our best practices and the lessons that we've learned, not just locally amongst all different groups and communities, like how does the Rockaways learn from Coney Island, how does it learn from Hunts Point, the Lower East Side from Red Hook, but also then going nationwide and even globally. This is something that we're thinking about right now and taking the RAMP initiative and really expanding it globally into something we're calling the Delta Cities curriculum, sharing best practices and lessons learned with Bangladesh, with Hong Kong, with Jakarta, with Rotterdam. With that, I'll take it to discussion.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks everybody. I thought the comments were extremely important, and I want to direct my comments basically to Colvin on my question, primarily because you have to leave in a short while, and I wanted to sort of see whether or not we can get this discussion going. You mentioned, the formation of Dead Star Restoration Corporation as a comprehensive community development corporation. And when you discuss some of the things you're doing, in my head, I was hearing Juan Camilo's presentation Monday and Tuesday. Because if you begin to look at the elements of what is taking place there, it is a comprehensive approach to dealing with some of the most intensive challenges that we face. And what, for example, the issue, if you looked at the maps about heat and the fact that heat kills more people than anything else, actually, and it's very slow. It's not as dramatic as a storm and a flood, so it doesn't make the front page. But the great example is what happened in France a number of years ago, or what others have written about in Chicago a couple of years ago as well, where there were two communities side by side, particularly in Chicago. One which was well organized, had a committed social structure and organizational structure, and the other which had much more disorganization. Both were the same socioeconomic and racial communities side by side. One survived that heat wave much better than the other. And so how do we create that level of resiliency within a community, and how do you begin to adapt to what we know will happen, which is greater and greater heat? And it doesn't have to be decades from now. It could be this summer, for all we know. The number of 100-degree days that we're going to be achieving is going to go up each year. And one can't really predict when they're going to happen, but they will happen. So the question is, as we're adapting to it, and the other thing that came to my mind is it's not 100 billion that we need, it's $1,000 billion. These are huge sums of money. If you take those sums, or even the 30 billion New York is supposed to get to recover from Sandy, figure out that half of that may be for hardware, the other half has to go into labor. That's a huge opportunity to put people to work, to begin to develop